Welcome to this evening's program, When Things Don't Work Out as Planned, Single Heads of Household in the Orthodox Jewish Community. My name is David Schwartz, and I'm president of Porat and pleased to present this evening's program. Yesterday, we read Parshat Vayigash. Vayigash means to come close with a purpose. Yehuda approaches the viceroy of Egypt, who Yehuda does not realize is his brother Yosef. Citing the word's use in other contexts, the Midrash explains that Yehuda's purpose was for battle, argument, or supplication, whichever Yehuda thought would be necessary at the moment. The Midrash also suggests that Yehuda's approach toward the viceroy was not physical, but emotional, in order to understand what the viceroy was experiencing, to see things from his perspective, so that Yehuda could most effectively respond. Similarly, if we want to create welcoming and inclusive communities, we must approach one another with an open heart, ready to hear each other's story and respond appropriately. That is what we will be doing this evening, coming close in order to listen and listening in order to come close. In a moment, I will turn things over to our moderator, Ora Weinbach. But before I do, I want to share a few thank yous. First and foremost, I want to thank our panelists, Rabbi Michael Balinsky, Rabbi Noah Marlowe, and Rabbi Nancy Stern-Shalom. Second, I want to thank a committee of young Jewish leaders for helping to craft tonight's event. The committee includes our moderator, Ora, and speaker, Noah, Maharat Ruth Balinsky, and Rabbis Lauren Berman, Eitan Cooper, and Stephen Gottlieb. It has been a pleasure working with all of you. Finally, I want to thank you, our audience, for attending. If you enjoy these programs, please consider making a contribution to support our free programming by visiting www.poratonline.org and clicking on the donate button at the top of the page. I hope that at the end of the program, you will stay for our moderated process groups, where we will have conversations during which we will ask you to, 1, share one thing that you heard during the program that was new to you, and 2, share one way you might act or think differently in the future because of something you heard tonight. It is our hope that these process groups will help move this event from theory to practice. And now I turn things over to Ora to begin this evening's panel. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure and privilege to be here to moderate this evening's panel. Over the next hour, we aim to present the personal experiences of the 3 panelists and, to a lesser extent, myself. We all identify either currently or at a previous point in our life as an individual head of household. Each of our panelists have many accomplishments and long, impressive resumes, which are available for you to read in the event's promotional materials. Tonight, however, we will focus on an aspect of their personal lives that doesn't usually make it onto a resume. Nancy Stern-Shalom will share her experience of getting and being divorced. Rabbi Michael Balinsky will talk about losing his wife and being a widower with young children. Rabbi Noah Marlowe will address being a single young adult in a community which assumes he should have already been married. I myself got divorced at 26 years old and lived on the Upper West Side in a public-facing Jewish communal leadership role as a single divorcee for a number of years. We are a group of 4 individuals with our own unique and complex circumstances and perspectives. We could not possibly claim to address the full range of topics or identities of people who could and should be on this panel. There are many stories that you won't hear tonight. For example, a single parent by choice, someone who identifies as asexual or LGBTQ, a widow or an older adult. There are also the many stories of parents, children, and friends of single heads of households. While we hope that tonight's program speaks in some way to everyone and suggests concrete communal takeaways, we cannot claim to address everything. Rather, we're just trying to get a tough conversation started. There are many beautiful reasons why the family stands at the center of Jewish communal life. And we as a community need to grow in our understanding about how idealizing such a particular picture of what a Jewish life should look like can unintentionally harm many people. The modern Orthodox world has much room to grow in the way that we relate to individuals who don't fit the mold. It's our hope that through open and generous listening, starting tonight and continuing past tonight, we can become a more compassionate, welcoming, and supportive community. And so we ask that you listen with an open heart and care as we hear from our guest speakers tonight. As you listen, if you would like to ask our panelists a question, please use the Zoom chat function. There is time set aside at the end of our program for audience Q&A. Let's get started. Welcome, Nancy, Noah, and Michael. Thank you in advance for being willing to share so fully of yourself and your personal stories. We're going to get started by hearing from Noah. Noah, here's your chance to share with us about where you stand and why you are on this panel.
Thank you, Ora. In January of 2019, my life took an unexpected turn. I was starting my first year of rabbinical school at Yeshiva University, and I was excited about my journey into the rabbinate and becoming a Jewish educator. And about a month before I was supposed to get married, I had a broken engagement. And that wasn't my plan. My plan was I was going to be a married person in the Orthodox community. I was going to start rabbinical school as a married student. And all of a sudden, my vision, my dreams, my anticipation of what my experience would be like in the modern Orthodox community in general and as a rabbinical student in specific completely changed. And in the wake of this process, I started to notice differences in how we treat married and single individuals within the modern Orthodox community. And this evening, I'd like to share some of my own reflections and experiences in trying to help us understand what's been going on and what happens in the modern Orthodox community. In the wake of my broken engagement, I had a lot of social isolation. A lot of people, when encountering family members or friends who experienced loss, are unsure how to relate to them. And they often take a step back and give space in order for the person to grieve in a way that she or he is best able to. But that often results in great social isolation, something which, in a case of a broken engagement, was something that I was already feeling and suffering from. And one area that I felt this acutely was on Shabbos. While previously I used to have Shabbos meals with other couples and single individuals, and I almost never had a problem receiving an invitation or hosting a Shabbos meal. After my broken engagement, I spent countless Shabboses eating alone. And I sat in profound sadness and loneliness on Shabbos, which is meant to be a time for not only spiritual connection, but also social connection and development. And I noticed that this experience that I had wasn't unique to me, that there are many people who are single in the modern Orthodox community who maybe don't receive an invitation to a Shabbos meal, and they feel so ashamed or embarrassed about the fact that they didn't receive an invitation that they would rather just have a meal alone in their own apartment than reach out to somebody else and ask them, are you hosting a meal? Would you be able to take me along with you? And so I noticed that there was a difference in the way that married and single folks were experiencing Shabbos. In my second year of rabbinical school, I attended a friend of mine's Sheva Brachot, and at the meal there were three different tables. There was one table of married men, there was another table of married women, and there was a third table of single guys. I didn't understand why were there two tables, one for married and single men. I felt confident, I felt good about what I'd been doing in rabbinical school, about my professional ambitions and trajectory and aspirations. I'd been accepted to several prestigious rabbinic fellowships, and I felt good about who I was. And it was in that one moment of having to sit at this table that was designated just for single folks, I felt like that was all shattered. I felt like everything that I'd been building of trying to become an adult, to try to become a participant and contributor to the Jewish community, I felt that it had fallen apart. And this experience of the Sheva Brachot is only one of many, whether it's on Shabbos or at a wedding. Many times we create artificial distinctions and separations between married and single folks. At the beginning of COVID, back when we're still trying to figure out the new normal, YU, and I want to share a lot of hakarat tov, a lot of gratefulness that I have for YU doing this, created a Zoom program that was co-facilitated by one of the rabbis and psychologists of the rabbinical program to help speak about the experience of married rabbinical students during the beginning of COVID and navigating the new normal. And the goals were to help validate the experience and challenges of married rabbinical students, and also to provide some practical ideas and strategies to how to cope with these unexpected circumstances. And when I saw that this session was only open to married students, I once again felt like, what's going on? What's happening? Am I not an adult? Am I not allowed to be part of this community? Just because I'm not in a relationship doesn't mean that I can't understand the dynamics and complications of a newlywed couple dealing with having their in-laws, in the upstairs of and living in the basement of their in-laws' house. I could understand that, even though I wasn't married. And so Chatai Ani Mazkir Hayom, I went to the Zoom session anyways, because I wanted to know what was this experience. I wanted to know how were my fellow peers struggling, and I wanted to know how I could best support them. And I felt, even though this was meant only for married students, I thought that for myself and for them, it would be beneficial if I attended. These experiences, I think each one continues to compound, I think, a feeling of infantilization that singles within the modern Orthodox community do not feel like they're fully adults. And another experience that I had last year, as I was applying to several rabbinic fellowships and programs in the Orthodox community, I had an experience where the interviewer would ask me if I was married, which is an understandable question to ask a rabbinical student or a rabbi, when communities often would like to have a rabbinic couple, which is something that I understand. And for me, that was something that was challenging to respond to, because there was so much baggage that I had. Well, I'm single, but I was in a relationship for 2 years and I had a broken engagement, and how am I supposed to answer this question? And so sometimes I would respond, yeah, I'm single, but I had a broken engagement. And other times I didn't feel I had the strength, or I felt a little too disadvantaged in that position to say anything. And unfortunately, I got responses of, you really should start dating, or is that something, is dating something that you'd like to do? And I was just shocked, as someone who is getting close to entering the rabbinate, that I was hearing rabbis with pastoral training say to me, you really should start dating, and speaking to me as if, I'm not an adult, that I'm not able to see ahead and make mature decisions about my future. And these different experiences have completely changed the type of person, and hopefully the type of rabbi that I'm becoming, because they've given me such a great perspective on what it's like to feel like an outsider. I think what's unique about my experience, and why I wanted to emphasize the rabbinic part, is that rabbis have a certain amount of prestige and social capital within the community. And so I think that if somebody who has a position that comes with that type of prestige and social capital is treated in this way, how much more so are others treated this way? And I'd like to just end off with speaking about how I've changed my own personal narrative. Even though there might be problems within the culture and certain perceptions of what it means to be single, I've realized that it's important to have beliefs about myself that don't relate to my marital status, to realize that I'm a compassionate and sensitive and empathic brother and son and friend and teacher, and that I'm an aspiring educator, and I'm a soulful educator, and I'm passionate about my avodat Hashem and growing in my religious life, and feeling that I can make a difference in the lives of others, and that I don't have to feel that I'm just single, that being single is what defines me, but rather it is all of the other parts of me, and it's all the other experiences that I have that really defines me.
Thank you so much, Noah, for sharing that, especially the specific examples that you gave, I think really bring to light some of the issues that you mentioned and that I believe will come up throughout the evening. So thank you so much. Nancy, we would love to have a chance to hear a little bit about you and your story.
Well, my story is 15 years ago, I got divorced after a very challenging and difficult 31 plus years marriage. And I moved to Riverdale to start my new life. I had been warned by someone who lived in the community that Riverdale wasn't a single community. And I thought, well, I'm not looking for a single community. I'm not looking to live on the Upper West Side. I'm looking to live in a community. And I was so naive in doing that. I had expected, I grew up in an Orthodox community, whatever neighborhood I lived in, I went to a Young Israel. I know how to walk the walk and talk the talk and be part of the community. I've always been on the sisterhood. I've been on the board of a shul, so that I didn't have a spouse and I wasn't living in a singles community. I didn't see that as Noah said, that I would not be allowed to be part of the community. Very early on, I went to someone who I sort of knew who was sitting Shiva in Riverdale. And another woman came in and someone said to me, "Oh, do you know her? You would like her." So I went over to this woman who had just walked in and I said, "Hi, my name is Nancy. May I assume you're divorced?" And she started laughing because we were sharing the chayrim, and the person who had sent me over to her knew nothing about me. So what could she know that I would make friends with this woman? What else did we have in common but that we were both divorced? This woman was very helpful and she let me in on something called being Shabbos. So I don't know if any of you others have been Shabbos. And Rabbi Krohn has a wonderful tape that I heard on his being guilty of Shabbosing people. Being Shabbos is when you're leaving shul, someone comes over to you and invites you to their home. Depending on your desperation, you either accept or you go home by yourself. If you accept, you might find that as you walk through the door, someone sees you and runs to get another plate to add to the table. You usually sat near the children at the other end. And if you look around, you're not the only guest at the table. There might be 4 or 5 or 6 other people who obviously were not Shabbos, but were worthy of getting a proper invitation, a phone call, an email, not 5 minutes before the meal. In shul, I was davening. I don't cover my hair anymore in shul. So I'm not married, but I'm not 15, 25 years old. So my davening has been interrupted by someone coming over to me in shul to ask me, who do I live with? I live with myself. I've been asked, do you have a family? As opposed to being patched. I've been asked, someone has come over to me and said, are you married? And I said, no, not anymore. And she said, oh, I didn't think so, but I was talking about you to someone else and they thought you were married. So I could be interrupted in davening to clarify my marital situation. I was once, this is one of my friend's favorite stories, so I promised to tell this one. I was once invited to a couple, and there were, I think, 3 other couples at the table, all of which it was either their second marriage, either to both couples or to one of the people within the couple, it was a second marriage. And one of the guests asked our hostess, how did you meet each other? So the hostess answered, and then they proceeded to go around the table telling how they met each other. I was the last one. The couple before me who was sharing how they met each other happened to have been friends of mine. And when it was my turn, they were already like laughing their heads off because people were oblivious that I had been glad that I had been invited, and I got a real invitation, and I hadn't been Shabbos. Probably my favorite story is, thank God I have a big table, and pre-COVID days, I can fit 12 people around my Shabbos or Yontif table, and I usually fill it up. I have asked men to lead the benching. And so men at my table, eating the food that I bought with the money I earned, that I schlepped home and I cooked and I plated and put on my table, lead the benching. And 8 out of 10 will always thank the Baal Habayit. And I always have to point out there is no Baal Habayit. When I went to my shul, the rabbi, I guess I can give a cheer, Rabbi Avi Weiss and his wife Toby were incredible to me. And if not for Rabbi Weiss, I would not have gotten my get as quickly as I did. And they invited me so many times that it was almost embarrassing to keep going to their home. They were fantastic. But within the shul, I wasn't greeted. I wasn't welcomed. I was, people I think couldn't quite figure out who or what I was. But the message of the establishment of the shul was that events took place. There was, you could pay $10 if you were a single. If you were a couple, you paid $18. I call that the singles tariff. It's not the only shul that does that. Many shuls do. There's another shul in Riverdale who I was in touch with the rabbi, and he asked me, asking him about the event, and I pointed out to him that I felt this was a punitive measure, that I should have to pay more because I was a single. And he said this was the policy of the shul. And the night before the event, this other rabbi called me to say he really hoped I was coming. And I said, I don't pay a tariff. I'm not paying the levy on being single. Any event that takes place when you have a family charge, that indicates to me either I'm not welcome because I'm not a family, or I'm paying as much as a family, which is, again, we're back to this punitive punishment for being a single. In a shul bulletin on before Sukkot, was an ad. If anyone has room at their Sukkot table for a young couple or a young family, why not me? During COVID, I had said to someone that, it's really a challenge to have a Seder by myself, though I've had a Seder by myself when it wasn't COVID. I asked questions, I answered questions, and a woman said to me, oh, I know, my husband and I were alone also. So once you have a we, the word alone is a little different than an I was alone. My advantage over these 15 years has been twofold. Number one, I have a table, I have a home and Harknosses Archim have been very important always in my family and in my life. And so I can very easily, I'm set up to invite people, and I do. Not everyone, whether they're single or married, are comfortable inviting. My other advantage, which was hard won, when I first moved, I was so lonely. I thought I could die of the loneliness. Now I'm not. So I can go, Shabbos doesn't scare me, not even those long summer ones, 3-day Chagim, I'm fine. I have my books, I'm good, I'm fine being alone. So I don't need to make that decision if someone is Shabbosing me. And so being alone isn't an issue. How people are treated as being alone is the issue. I know a woman who was a widow, and she stopped going to shul. She said to go to shul and sit alone, to walk home alone and see couples and families walking together, and then to sit down at her Shabbat table alone was just too much. I've joked, Hester Prynne and I both wear a big A, but mine is for alone. And so I'd like to conclude by saying that being alone is not an avera. and you don't treat people in your community as if they've committed one. And don't put Noah at the wrong table or segregate him or isolate him because he is alone. Let's look at Sefer Bereshit. Let's get past Noah. Let's get past putting people in pairs, and only the pairs get onto that boat, because I wouldn't get on. Let's go further. Let's go to Avraham Avinu. When those three Malachim came, Avraham Avinu did not say to them, are you married? Who do you live with? I'll Shabbos you. I'm having some other couples are coming over, but I'll let you can sit, you can sit and see if there's any sand room left for you. Avraham Avinu welcomed those Malachim. And I would beseech the people who are listening to do the same. And whether you are divorced or a widow or have a broken engagement, you've been through enough. I don't want to be Rahmanis. I don't want anyone starting to invite me now. But the way a shul, the way an individual responds to you, looks at you, talks to you, treats you, is so important to giving you the space. And as Orthodox Jews, so much of our lives are spent around our shul and our Shabbos table and our Yontif table and our Seder and Shiva calls. And do not treat us like we are not part of your community, because one day, and everyone should live to 120, and everyone who's married should stay married to 120. And I don't wish anybody a catastrophic plane crash or car crash, but one day everybody is going to be alone and should not be treated without respect and dignity.
Thank you, Nancy, for sharing. So impassioned. I particularly appreciate the concrete suggestions that you gave. We're going to have more of a chance to hear from our other panelists as well, some specific things that might change in our communities in order to treat the single people the way they should be treated, like you kind of, made a call for. So thank you for that. Next, we're going to hear from Michael, who's going to share with us his story.
Hey, thank you, Ora. My first wife, Deborah, had her cancer discovered with the birth of our second child in September 1987. The birth did not cause the cancer, but it enabled us to discover and treat it, giving Deborah a few extra years. After my own bout with cancer the previous year and our renewed hope for the future, suddenly Deb had to face this fear of cancer again. Now, as a young mother of two children, Ruthie and Miriam, both of whom were under 3. Surgery was not an option, and chemotherapy and radiation were the suggested form of treatment. Deborah was able to nurse for a few weeks, but had to stop because of toxicity of the drugs. With lots of support from friends and her small family of her mother and her sister, the roller coaster of 6 months of treatment began. The doctors told us that the studies showed good results were expected for 3 to 5 years post-treatment. They were both fortunately and unfortunately correct. While there were initially good results, by July 1991, the cancer returned and spread. Deborah wailed and wailed on hearing the news. "Promise me," she said, "that you'll get married again." Another cycle of treatment began. She would always come home after her stay in the hospital for her treatment, eager to see me and the 2 girls. But from this last hospital visit, she did not return. And Deb died on Hey ER, May 7th, 1992. She was 36. My kids, Ruthie and Miriam, were 7 and 4. The next morning, my mother-in-law and I woke the girls to tell them that Mom had died and we had to go to the funeral at noon. They both looked up and asked, "Will we get a new mom?" I mention this background because while the loss was profound for me, the pain was intense and the feeling of hopelessness and aloneness was so real. Deep down, I knew that Deborah was dying. A good friend who was a doctor had made that gently clear to me a few months earlier. Her death was not a shock. In a way, looking back, I realized that in some form, I was already mourning for her, even during the last few months. And while I was mourning, certainly after Deb died, after a couple of months, I was also looking ahead to what might be in the future. And this would, of course, be very different for someone, a widow or widower, whose spouse had died suddenly. I was fortunate to have close friends and my mother-in-law and sister-in-law who were of enormous help. But it was critical for me that while I certainly needed help, I also wanted to continue our regular family routine. Our community was small, centered around the Hillel at Northwestern University, where I was the rabbi and director. And our minyan had students, faculty, and community members. They all knew Deborah. They had all been in our home for Shabbat and holiday activities. While I could lean on them, and they were there for me, I still made Shabbat and holidays after a couple of months at home, inviting guests to come on a regular basis. I was also fortunate that the kids' school was really supportive of them, and with rare exception, remembered not to give them assignments or make something for Mother's Day. But I do remember my daughter Miriam telling one of her teachers that on one day she was having a hard time when was really missing her mom. The teacher told me about it. She was really compassionate with Miriam. Well, it turned out that Miriam certainly did miss her mom. Truth was, she had not completed an assignment, and she was using it as an excuse for not doing her work. I was proud of her for that. After a couple of months, I began to date. People were willing to fix me up. I was still mourning, but wanted to move ahead with my life. And I reasoned whatever pain might come out of dating and having to break up with someone, I had already experienced the worst pain I could imagine. My friends, all of whom were close with Deborah, were supportive of my dating, and except maybe for one or two who did not do anything negative, but I think they could never really accept that I would get married again. A friend took me to a party a few months after Deb had passed away. I will not bore you with the full story, but at one point I went to get a drink and a woman said hi to me and said, "You may not remember me." And I looked at her, knew exactly who she was, though I did not remember her name. We had met very briefly for maybe 5 to 10 minutes 2 years earlier, when she had recently moved to Chicago and came to Rosh Hashanah services at Northwestern. During our conversation, she mentioned something about her shul. I asked which shul it was, and she answered Anshe Shalom, an Orthodox shul. I immediately thought this cannot be an accident, and that God was looking over my shoulder. She thought, well, what do you talk about with an Orthodox rabbi? And so she mentioned shul. February 6, 1994, I married her. My kids walked with me down the aisle. I spoke under the chuppah describing how I met Myra during my nightmare and my love and admiration for her. But most of all, how grateful I was for her willingness not only to marry me, but to become the parent of 2 young girls. This was not the relationship she expected, to marry a widower with 2 kids, but she was willing to take a chance and date me. I am forever grateful to our friends, especially those who were really close with Deborah. They embraced Myra and celebrated our joy. I continue to mourn a little bit for Deborah every day. I am also really happily married to Myra. It is a blessing to me that both emotions live within me. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing that with us. It was very moving. So thank you, each one of you, for using that time to share with us your personal stories and experiences. I want to kind of ask a few questions, throw it out there, popcorn style, to the panelists. We're going to have, I think, time for 2 questions before we open up for audience question and answer. So if, as you have been listening, you have questions, please feel free to shoot them in the chat, and we're collecting them and we'll ask them in a little bit. So sometimes, as we've all experienced, other members of our community might feel hesitant or awkward or unsure about how to speak with you about your experience, or, as we talked about, invite you to a Shabbat meal. What advice can you share with others about how to most appropriately interact with someone whose family or home life looks different than the norm? Michael.
Well, in the case, well, in my own case, but I think in speaking with other widowers as well, particularly where there are small children, helping them being able to normalize their existence, to get back to a normal routine. People were certainly there when Deborah was sick, and people are there when the spouse is sick, and helping out. And I think our communities are very good on that. The challenge becomes wanting to continue to help, yet also being able to facilitate what is, I think, needed in many cases for the families, is to return to some sense of normal existence. So where people certainly can be helpful is, one, ask, how can I be helpful? But only ask it if you're willing to be helpful. It's okay to say, I'm not sure, admit, I'm not sure what's going on. I really want to be helpful to you. People will accept that. When people are presumptuous, it becomes very difficult. Even in the case of mourning a loss, and particularly someone who was part of a community, realize that your mourning is intense, but it's different than the actual family who's mourning. And while that can be shared, but also to recognize that distinction. So as much as possible, and certainly I remember in my case, what one can do to help with some typical mundane things that families have to worry about with young kids: carpool, babysitting, helping out with some other aspects that may come out. A friend of mine who was a widower said someone came to help them do the laundry. Some of those little things, so that the person can then become used to doing these things, and being able just then to do it on a normal basis, so that you want them to become as independent as they can, as much as they feel still these strong connections to the community. So it's being able to navigate those elements.
Thank you. I thought what you said about being presumptuous is really interesting. And in a lot of ways, people's awkwardness or discomfort actually comes from like their own experience or judgment or something that's going on inside of them that kind of gets like inflicted on to the other person. And even just listening to even the different desires that Nancy and Noah expressed about invitations to Shabbat meals, where Noah was like, I'm alone, invite me. And Nancy's like, I'm okay being alone. Like, you don't have to nebuch, invite me. And I remember when I was kind of single on the Upper West Side, I would be leaving shul and people are like, oh, what are you doing for lunch? And I was like, oh, I'm going home. I'm, have a good book to read. I have my own little meal. People are like, you're eating alone? I'm so sorry. And I'm like, no, actually, I'm kind of fine with it. I've been in shul all morning. Like, I'm okay to go hang out by myself, right? So I think there's this importance about just really like asking the other person what they want and being attentive to like their desires and their experiences, and not assuming that that person wants to be alone or wants to be with people or wants help or doesn't want help, and just ask, right? With like a open, genuine question mark, right?
So I think it's important. I mean, I don't have a husband. That doesn't mean I have two heads. So I'm a regular person. I don't need extra care. I don't need to be I'm not breaking. I'm not, if you want to invite me, or if I meet someone, now in shul, I ask someone, so I just spoke to someone this week who just moved to the neighborhood. I don't know if she's married or a widow or divorced. I asked her, are you moved in enough? Are you okay enough with COVID? Are you free for a meal? If she would have said yes, then I would have said, how many are you? And she would have said 1, 2, or hopefully not 6. But the idea is that if you were a couple when you were leaving shul, or instead of being divorced, and people would somebody have said, are you guys okay going home alone by yourselves? Like, why is that? Why are you different? Why are you treated differently? And if you're so concerned about me, don't wait till I'm leaving shul, getting ready for my book. Like, I have food at home. Trust me, I don't need yours. And my book might be better company, but it might not be, and I might be desperate. So there are ways to include people and make them feel good without, I don't need anybody's charity. I don't need anybody's pity. I just need people to accept me or dislike me based on me, not by if I have a ring on my finger.
Yeah, something that I want to talk a little bit about, kind of like the immediate aftermath of loss. I think people often want to acknowledge what it is that they are going through in their experience, and others don't know what to say to them. I know when I had my broken engagement, like all I wanted to talk about was like I had a broken engagement, and I just didn't feel like I had the ability within my social circles to do that. And it took a really, really long time, like months and months and months, for people even to like acknowledge it. And I think something that's really important and something that's really small is it's as easy as just, shooting somebody a note and saying like, I'm thinking of you. And we often think that we need to do some sort of big gesture to help somebody, to comfort somebody. But really something can be as small, and each person can make their own, decision based off of how comfortable they feel with the other person about how much they'd like to, ask them about their situation. But it can be something as small as just saying, I'm thinking of you. Something else I'd like to add that's, a little bit different as it relates to single folks. I think people often try to set single folks up, which is beautiful. And I think that there are two things I see very often. One is married people who are just like, you're kind of like an object. Like, I'm just going to see like, who can I send you to? And like, what matches can I make? And I think that kind of objectifies people. People are more than just someone who is not yet, dating, or someone who's not yet married. I think it's super important. Well, I so value the desire that people have to set others up. It's so important to acknowledge, who they are and what they're up to. I had a friend who's in law school, and someone reached out to him and said like, hey, I know we haven't spoken in 3 years, but like, how are you doing? And also, by the way, I want to set you up with someone. And it's like, oh, well, law school is going well. So like, thanks so much for asking. And like, yeah, like my life is great. Thanks so much. So I think it's important to like, remember like the person in front of you is a human being. And they are a composite of so many different parts and so many different facets. So I'd say like, that's one response. The other response that I would say the younger people have when they go back to their home communities is community members, asking them about dating and setting them up. And sometimes, even though it might come from a good place, it might be, a little bit insensitive or offensive. So it's important to recognize what are proper boundaries, and recognizing whether you're, the right person to make that suggestion.
Yeah, Noah, that's great. Like always the question of like, do you want to be set up? Or like, are you interested? Like, that's the first question that people, need to ask. Not like, oh, I know someone who's definitely your husband or what, right? Like just asking where the other person is at. I also really appreciate the point that you made about just sending a note and saying like, hi, I'm thinking about you. One of the things I thought about a lot after my divorce was that like, it's really common, like when people get engaged or married or have a baby, right, to post about it on social media. And like, that's always the post that has the most likes and the most reaction from people. And it's like not a thing to be like, I got divorced yesterday, right? Like, that's not really how this functions. Or in others said, like, I lost a child, or I miscarried, or right? Like these tragic things are not things we often publicize in the same way. And therefore people are less likely to reach out. But I personally appreciated every single message that I got from people that were just saying, hey, I heard you got divorced. I just want you to know I love you. I think you're awesome. And I'm here for you if you want to talk. And I never wanted to talk to any of them usually, but it just felt good to know that somebody was thinking about me and looking at me in the face, right? And not just like ignoring and not making eye contact. Yeah, Nancy.
I'm sorry. When I got divorced, most people were shocked, were surprised. One woman called me because she had to tell me she hadn't slept for 3 nights because I got divorced. So I also think as Orthodox Jews, we're used to having ritual, and there's not a lot of ritual around a broken engagement or a divorce. The get, like, really, I guess that's a ritual, but it's not something you see a lot. You don't get invited to people's gets, but so I created my own get. I had a get together after I was divorced, and I invited close friends who I felt had helped in the Nancy Survival Program. And I had it catered, and everyone came. Even a friend of mine from New Zealand made the trip, and all my dear friends got together with me for my get together. I melted down my wedding band. I was having tremendous PTSD after my divorce. And so I tried to create my own system for dealing with it. I don't think there's a bracha you say when you get divorced. But so I try to create my own. And just one other thing that Noah had touched upon, none of us, I've never met a child who, when you say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I've never heard a child say, I want to grow up and be divorced, or I want to grow up and have a broken engagement, or I want to grow up and be a young widow or widower with 2 small children. We're all leading lives that we had not planned, that we had not intended. When you tell your kids, Dad and I are getting divorced, that's not the conversation you say, oh, I can't wait to get divorced so I can break the news to my children. I mean, all of these things are not what we wanted. We didn't plan for this to happen. This was not part of the playbook. And so we're dealing with things that have smacked us in the face that we have had to deal with and get up and go to work the next day or the next week. And so then a community that doesn't help you stand up straight is disappointing.
Can I just add one other aspect? More to the, it may apply more to the widower situation. But a friend who had lost a wife suggested this to me that was really helpful for him, and some others as well, that some people in the community be willing not to substitute as the parent who was lost, but in the case of someone, a widower with daughters, find some women in the community who are not a mother substitute, but someone they can certainly turn to. In fact, he told me that before his daughter was about to go to university, he asked someone to whom he was close in the community if she could have a sex talk with his daughter, just to, the response was, certainly, I'm very touched you asked, and I forgot to do it with my own daughter before she went to
Second chances.
But being open to that and knowing where, certain situations you can step in, and also when you're, asked to do that as well.
Thanks. That's such an interesting suggestion. And I also think, just to build off of that, I think this is one area as well where our community can really benefit by increasing, this is my own thing, but by increasing the number of women who are in Jewish communal leadership positions. I think sometimes, especially in this kind of situation where there's a young girl growing up in a family without a mother figure or not in that in the Jewish community, I think it could be a really amazing resources for communities to think about investing in placing women, giving them the jobs and responsibilities to be role models and for young women. So I think that's another place that communally we can look to for support. And to that, oh no, is there something you want to say before that was my transition to our next question? Okay, great. So I want to make sure before we open up to Q&A that we transition some of these ideas to concrete suggestions. So the one I just gave, there were a few that were already made, but just to wrap it up, if we could try to think of maybe one each of a concrete step that a shul, a school, or another communal institution could make to make it clear that that we are full and welcome members of the community. There's people on this call who are presidents of shuls, who are rabbis of shuls, who are heads of schools, teachers, social workers, members of the community, right? What can we ask and hope that our community can do different to make this community a better place?
Well, when David Schwartz was president of the shul, he asked me if I would like to be on the board. And I said, you don't want me to be on your board because I'm not going to agree and I'm going to speak up and I'm going to disagree and make trouble. And David said, that's exactly what I want. So I had usually been on a shul board or a sisterhood board, but this was very different. I really did it besides wanting to be on it, I did it very much for chinuch. I wanted everyone to see that even though I was alone, I was allowed to be on the shul board, and even one person at least considered me a real person.
Nancy, that's such an interesting suggestion. I think we're in a place in the world and in our community where we think about and recognize how important it is that the institutional leadership, the board makeup, needs to represent the diversity of the community, whether that be in age, in gender, or in your case, right, marital status or an identity. Maybe these are things that we should be considering as well, so people can see themselves in leadership positions in the shul. Thanks, Nancy. That's really helpful suggestion. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, what I mentioned before about asking the people, but also I think just a culture in which they become people in these quote unquote different situations, of the unexpected, whatever one wants to describe it, that it becomes normalized folks within the congregation. Exactly the example you just mentioned about, joining the board. It's not that we have a slot in our board for someone who's divorced. No, you just someone come on, join the board, and that we are open just to the people themselves, but also, again, as much as possible to people to feel that this is now my normal existence, and this is now my normal existence for the kids, and there needs to be sensitivity. But they also just has to be adapted as, okay, you have this, you have that, and we can attempt this sense of integration as much as possible. And at the same time, keeping in mind and being sensitive to this, people may very well also be suffering. And so navigating between those two points of being both sympathetic and really helpful, but also supporting so that people become autonomous in the best sense within the functioning whole of the community.
So I think something that was a common thread in my experience was not being allowed to participate because I was single. And so I think something that we as a community can do to help make single individuals feel more included in the community is to open up as much as possible programming to married and single individuals alike. And I want to give a special shout out to the TNEC Yoetzet Halakha initiative. There was an event a few weeks ago with Yoetzet Halakha, Tova Warburg-Sinansky, and Dr. Shai Krug that was about relationships and intimacy. And on the flyer, they wrote, "This event is for anyone who's been in a relationship, is currently in one, or is hoping to be in one." And I think that language was beautiful. And I think that when our communities are really able to open things up, I think it would be very helpful. And this is my own view. If we opened up conversations about intimacy to single individuals as well, and try to allow single individuals to feel part of what it means to be an adult in the Jewish community. And I think that in all areas, we should really try our best to be open and to be inclusive.
Amazing. So we have a lot of really amazing audience questions that have come in, and I want to make sure we give a chance to ask those and talk about them. But before we turn to the audience questions, I just want to thank each one of you again so much for sharing so generously and vulnerably and honestly and passionately about your experience, and really with the constructive aim of making our community a better place. So thank you so much, and let's take some questions in a minute.
Wow. Thank you so much, Nancy, Noah, Michael, and Ora. What an amazing program. Thank you so much for sharing so freely of your experiences. I also want to share the many people who've participated in the chat and have shared such wonderful suggestions and ideas, along with the questions that they've shared. And as a reminder, I wanted to note that we'll be going to process group in about 15 minutes after we deal with the Q&A. And during that, we'll be looking to discuss two things. One is to share something that you heard during the program that was new to you, and to share something that you might, some way in which you may think or act differently in the future because of something you heard tonight. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Ora to run our Q&A. And again, thank you all so much for what an amazing presentation, and looking forward to hearing your answers to some terrific questions that have been posted in the chat.
Thank you. So now that I've had like a second, to read through the chat and see all of the comments that are coming in, I think before we even get to questions, I think it's important to acknowledge how many people in this room have shared experience and have unique experience with our panelists, and really clearly have a wealth of information and feelings that should be honored and heard and shared. So thank you for using this space, and we hope that sharing continues in the process groups that are going to be taking place, as David mentioned, taking place after this session. I also want to thank all of the suggestions, right? As we were making our suggestions on this panel, everyone here, again, in this resource of, this room with many experiences, we're also making their suggestions. And there's some really great things on here, and I'm sure somebody on the Porat team is taking notes. So thank you so much for sharing, all of you in the room, for sharing your experiences and your suggestions. I wanted to open a question that we received to our panelists, and this is about our comfort when we are in the moment in these situations where people act towards us in a way that makes us feel uncomfortable, like we shared, either when we get Shabbos, or when somebody places us at the singles table, or we feel in any way othered. So in that moment, what is that experience like? And do we feel comfortable correcting people's erroneous assumptions and presumptuous behavior? Or does that feel too difficult for us in the moment? And like, what is that experience for you like?
Well, I happen to belong to a wonderful shul whose mandate is inclusion, and whose clergy is very open and very willing and very eager to hear. So, but I do think when they see my name in an inbox, they want to buy me membership in another shul. And I I always do let the shul know if there has been a whoops experience, not so much for myself, but because for all the other singles who eventually will email or whisper in my ear, look what happened. And I think that the shul setting the right example, it starts at the top. And if your shul is going out of their way to try to make you feel better and be part of the shul and have other people see that, I think that's very important. For individuals, if I spent my life correcting every stupid thing somebody says, like, I wouldn't have time to be alive. So if somebody Shabboses me, no one who does any of these averas does it for a negative reason. I mean, my mouth and my brain are not necessarily always connected. Nobody says, oh, I'm going to get Nancy. I'm going to go over there and Shabbos her. But there are ways, to do it. And I don't think anyone means badly by it. I think people aren't aware of it and aren't necessarily paying attention. I met someone on the street who said to me, send regards home. So that person was being nice. I came home and I went over to my plants and I said, regards. It's not necessary. It's not coming out of any dark place. So I don't think it's my responsibility to correct people. And very often, if somebody has Shabbosed you, you're so desperate and so grateful that you are going to somebody's house. It just doesn't seem appropriate, and I don't think it's my job to correct.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I think that there's like a great distinction to draw in terms of, let's say, cultural or systemic problems. So for example, having 3 separate tables, that's more of like a cultural or systemic problem that we create these artificial separations. So I wouldn't object to that in the moment. I wouldn't say like, no, I refuse on principle. I will not sit at the table as assigned.
Switch all of the place cards.
Exactly. But I would say the other scenario is when someone says to me like Mazel Tov, and I'm like, for what? And they're like, you got married, right? And so I would say that's the other scenario in which I think now that it's been a long time, it's very different. I used to feel very uncomfortable. I would start to get anxious. Definitely would start, sweating. I would start breathing a little bit more heavily. So I think that's like a harder scenario. And in that scenario, I try to say as sensitively as possible to the other person, because I realize if they made me feel uncomfortable, why should I make them feel uncomfortable also? So I try to minimize the discomfort they say and say, I don't want you to be offended in any way. I just want to let you know you might feel uncomfortable, but we actually didn't get married in the end, but like, I really don't want you to feel uncomfortable. Like, it's okay. So I think trying to say like, you know what, like just because I felt uncomfortable doesn't mean that we should spread the wealth.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I remember when I told people that I'd gotten divorced, I kept like apologizing. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I got divorced. And it was like such a weird thing to say, but I felt like I was making somebody else uncomfortable. It was, it was really, really difficult. And it's interesting because in general, I feel like a pretty self-confident person. I feel very readily able to be like, if it's about somebody else, to say something. But in these kinds of situations, I just didn't know what to say, even about myself. And it was really, really difficult in the moment, which is why I actually feel so grateful that Porat has put on this panel, right? Because it's a lot easier to talk about this outside of a specific situation or a specific incident and raise awareness in our communities so that when something, which it inevitably will, right? When something happens in real life, we can all kind of think back to this moment and be like, oh, wait, we knew that that wasn't the right thing to say. We know what to write, et cetera. We know what to do.
But just for myself, I think there were some people, and this was just while mourning and soon afterwards. I remember one comment a number of people gave to me, said, "Oh, your children will be a comfort to you." Well, that wasn't their job, and that's not the type of comfort I was looking for. I loved the kids. But it wasn't working. That was not comfort for me. Comfort for me would reach the point where I wanted to have a relationship. And I should add, I mean, one of the things I was blessed with, I'll say unfortunately, so I have a couple of rabbinic colleagues, and in those days when I was in Hillel, who had been in similar circumstances. And just being able to talk with them was so helpful and reinforcing. And so when I've met people in a similar circumstance, have gone through things like mine, I've been willing to say, if you want to talk with me, feel free. It depends, of course, on the nature, of the relationship.
Yeah, thank you. So we've gotten this question from a number of people, and I think I want to let's try to think about concrete, specific advice, because this is coming from a few people, of what is the appropriate greeting or response when you hear about the tragic or difficult news in somebody else's life. In some ways, Michael, I actually, wonder if this is a little bit more common in our community. Like we know, like say, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, or etc. Although, we're happy to hear from that also. But when you share about a divorce or a broken engagement, you're supposed to say, Mazel Tov, I'm sorry to hear that. Clearly not, oh my God, I'm shocked. That's right. But what is the appropriate response?
So I think a lot of it depends on how well you know the person. If they're a close friend, they may have seen it coming. They may know, some of the details. If it's someone within your community, you can say, I heard your news. I hope things will be okay for you. Again, if somebody dies, it's pretty straightforward. You're not going to say, oh, Mazel Tov, but if you're divorced, and people will start to say, oh, I cried for you, or I'm that. And it's just, it may not be a sad thing. It may be a challenging thing. When all of these are situations that are awkward. My son was living with me when his father died, and was after we were divorced, and his father died, and he was sitting shiva in my house. So if you wanted to know about awkward things that people have said, I mean, I could have done a whole routine on what people say when your ex-husband is dead and they come to make a shiva call to you. But people don't know. I don't know if there's necessarily a good thing. But I don't think to treat it as like, I'm sorry, this is the worst thing that ever happened to you and I can't believe it. Or people to say like, oh, I never liked him, or oh, you're lucky you did, you're lucky you escaped, or in 10 years, you'll look back, you'll meet someone else. All of these things that your mother's next door neighbor would say are probably not a good thing to say.
Yeah, I agree. I want to share a couple of things that I think are important. Number one is that when you're trying to comfort or address someone, the most important thing to be thinking about is what is best for them. It shouldn't be about you. It should be about them, right? So if you were to share, oh my gosh, I've been crying for you for 3 days, you're making it about you. And it's not about you. It's about them. So you want to try to make it as much about them as possible. And that means trying to ask them, how much they would be, what they need. Do they need support? Is it enough to just say, I'm sure that's so tough for you. That's so challenging. So I think that's really important. The second thing I want to add is that something that I think happens often within the Jewish community, because the Jewish community is so tight-knit, when you have a broken engagement or a breakup or a divorce, you have so many of these intermingled relationships. And so you have people who know both sides. And so often people don't know what to do. They don't know if they're supposed to talk to the other side. What if I only became friends with this couple because of one person, and now I'm here with the other person. Personally, something that was really challenging is when after my broken engagement, I had a lot of really close friends who were either married to or were friends with my ex-fiance. And it was really hard for me because I couldn't navigate. I didn't know what the feeling was. I didn't know, were they still friends with me? Were they not still friends with me? And it took a really long time to be able to have that conversation, even to just hear them, comfort me at all. So I think it's really important. Sometimes it's not just like, what am I saying? But it's just that I'm saying something at all, because it's so easy to just say, I'm sure that's really tough for you. And that breaks the ice, as opposed to making the person think, oh my gosh, I have to spend 3 months, 5 months, 7 months, 2 years thinking, does this person dislike me? Does this person hate me? And, that's really awful.
I think it's also important, like, don't ask questions. Like, you don't need to know. You can, even if you can't sleep for 3 nights, you don't need to know whose idea it was, what had happened, who's paying whom, who's getting the dog. I mean, you don't need to know. You don't need to cross-examine the person.
Michael, I want to give you space to say if you have something to contribute. If you don't, that's totally fine. We have other questions. I just wanted to.
No, you can move on to another question.
Okay. So it's interesting because surrounding this conversation is another question, which is about the fact that people in our community, maybe because it's so tight knit, people are talking and people know. And what's the balance to strike between, right, for other people who hear and want to be there for you or want to clarify your relationship? What's the balance between them bringing it up and saying, I heard XYZ and I'm sorry, I hope everything's okay, just let you know I'm here for you, or not bringing it up because you don't like, that means people were talking about you behind your back?
I would return to the response that I said before, which is the most important person to think about is the person who's in front of you. So you should ask yourself the question, which is, what will be best for that person? If you know them very well, so likely it would be helpful if you said something to them. If you don't know somebody very well, it's really easy to say something minimal and just say like, I'm so sorry for your loss, or that might be really challenging for you. So I think there's really no one size fits all answer. There's a range of possibilities, but really I think the most important principle to follow is just, what do you think would be best for this person?
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question before we transition to breakout rooms, but it touches on the question of being set up and the desire to get married or be remarried. So this is, I think, actually was a theme in everything that in each of your stories, and I think the question is like when is it appropriate for somebody to offer to introduce you to somebody and to make an introduction, and when does it feel inappropriate? So some of us gave examples in our stories, but if we could maybe try to synthesize that to a philosophy of shidduchs in the Orthodox community, that might be really helpful for people, because I think it's something that's really on people's minds.
Well, I think in the case of someone, in the case of, well, in my case, and widows and widowers, one can ask the person. It's hard to define an appropriate time. Again, I started dating after a couple of months. Was that appropriate or inappropriate? Fortunately, no one asked that question. And while, again, half that time I was mourning, half that time I was having actually a lot of fun dating, and it was relatively easy for me to meet people or to get fixed up, and at that point in my life. But it's best, of course, again, that I don't think you can go wrong asking someone, and they'll say, no, I'm not ready to date yet, but thank you for asking, and don't ask them why, just accept the thank you. And another response, wow, that's really nice of you, to consider that. So, yeah, let's follow up on it. So I don't think we can go wrong in asking, and then being also open. And also the second thing is having some sense when suggesting people, there isn't a right or wrong person, but having some sort of common sense, perhaps having a little more in common that you both are a widower, but that there may be something a little more that might connect you with that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with Michael. I think timing, like probably during Shiva might be a little too soon. I would wait till after Shloshim, but that's me. I think also just because somebody else is of a certain age and single, that doesn't make it a shidduch. I remember years ago one rabbi said a pair of pants and a skirt does not a shidduch make. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And also for those who are go back out onto the market after a long marriage, after a divorce, or after somebody has died, you know, like they may not have gone on a date for, 35 years. So their dating span might be longer than many of the people in this audience have lived. So it's, you're not in high school anymore, and that may have been, or college. And so you have to go out and saying to somebody, what's your major? It's not the opening line, in a date with someone. So for people to engage in a new world, or after you've been engaged and you think you've got it all sealed, and then you have to go back out and start all over again. So I think for the people to approach you gently, I think is important, and bring your brain to the conversation.
Yeah. I'll just add, I think it's interesting, right? I think this philosophy also applies to gay Jews, right? Like just because you have two gay Jewish people doesn't mean that like, oh my God, they're perfect for each other, right? And the same thing is true, right? Like, I think, Michael, you mentioned this in your story, that you were appreciative of your wife for being open to dating you, even though this might have been different and you had small children and maybe that wasn't what she expected, right? Like there's a variety, and that really, and I felt this when people tried to set me up. For me, it was mostly about like, do you actually know me? Or like, right, do you actually have a sense of who I am and the kind of person I would be a good partner to? Because if you don't really know me, then like, you just think I'm cute, like, which is very flattering, but like, also I don't need to waste my time having, another grande vanilla latte in Starbucks with like another guy, right? Like, so if there's a desire to really like be set up by somebody who knows you and cares about you and really like understands who you are. Noah, I guess if you have something to add, we can give you the final word before we go to process groups.
Yeah, I think the one last thing I'll add is just boundaries, like important word. I got a phone call from somebody a couple of weeks ago who I don't know, and they started talking to me and telling me about myself and why somebody that would be perfect for me to go out with. And it was like grossly inappropriate. I have no idea who they are. I have no idea how they got my phone number. And I think it's just really important. And I want to use an extreme case to kind of demonstrate the point. It's really important to recognize boundaries. You might not know somebody, and if you really don't know somebody, it probably isn't your responsibility. Just because that somebody has been divorced, or that somebody's a widower, or that someone had a broken engagement, doesn't mean that they need to be set up and that you're the right person to do it. But it's just really important to recognize boundaries.
Even if they want to go to Olam Haba.
Again, that's about their Olam Haba, not about your shidduch. Thank you so much, Noah and Michael and Nancy, for sharing so generously of yourself. Thank you again. And I just want to reiterate for everybody in this room, we did not exhaust this conversation. We do not represent the full spectrum of people who should be up here. This is just to begin a conversation in our community and raise awareness about how we can be really just a better people, a better Am Yisrael, and a better Orthodox community. So thank you so much for joining with us this evening. And I will turn it over to Rabbi David Schwartz, who is going to tell us a little bit, give us a little information for those of us who are interested in staying for process groups, and close out the program. So again, thank you so much, Noah, Michael, and Nancy, and to be continued.
And I'll just echo that with thanks to Noah, Nancy, and Michael, and to you as well, Ora. Thank you so much for leading the conversation. And now I'm really excited about the possibility of sort of having a chance to spend a little time to really process and think through how the things that came up during this session can be turned into actual practical useful steps that we can all take. And so, again, I'll remind everyone the two discussion points for process groups. One is share something that you heard during the program that was new to you. And then the second is to share one way that you might act or think differently in the future because of something you heard tonight. And so we'll give it a minute. Nobody is, of course, there's no requirement to stay, but we want to give this opportunity for those who are interested. We will keep the chat, and I will try and digest it into something that I will hopefully get posted on the Porat Facebook post, so that a number of the wonderful ideas can have an opportunity to live on. And again, I'll just close by noting the fact that the recording of this event will hopefully be posted in about a week on Porat's website at poratonline.org/events. And again, I encourage, if you enjoyed this event and found it helpful and meaningful, to please consider contributing at www.poratonline.org. At the top of the page, there's a donate button. Thank you so much. And we'll be back in about a minute in your divided out process groups. Thanks so much.